Welcome to Unit 9 of EDSE 512. We will have focus on several different areas within the IEP for this one-week unit. One of the topics that we'll be discussing is the idea of accommodations versus modifications, and we'll hit on that in this video in particular. The assignment for credit for this unit would be the IEP Critique 3, and there's a separate video to discuss the expectations for that assignment. So Unit 9, obviously we've got a focus on accommodations and modifications, and then we'll be approaching the critique. There are several different documents and presentations that are provided for you in this unit, so I'll let you just go through those. This one particular is addressing the idea of accommodations and modifications, which we'll hit on in a couple different areas in this video. But you'll see it start here, accommodations versus the modification. Modification being a change in what the student is expected to do, and accommodation being a change in the way that the student is receiving the instruction or responding to the instruction. This could also be a change in the administration of assessments. So that's when we're thinking about a small group, extended time, oral presentation on a test. All of those are accommodations. That would be a change in the administration of the assessment. And another common accommodation for response to instruction could be that the student is permitted to verbally express input instead of writing it down. If writing is not what's being assessed, for instance, but instead if we're looking for comprehension and awareness of the content and material, verbal or multiple modes of expression could be used. Sometimes students have the option to create a video instead of doing a public speaking presentation. If the student is dealing with a lot of anxiety and that's related to IEP needs, that could be an accommodation, creating a video or doing the presentation one-on-one in front of the teacher so that the content knowledge is still being displayed and demonstrated, but we're removing the public speaking component, which could be a barrier to the student's academic access in that scenario. So accommodations aren't changing the content, they're just changing the way that the students are receiving it or responding to it to demonstrate their mastery. And they're also changing the way that tests or assessments may be administered. We'll see a lot of these accommodation options in IEPs for students with mild to moderate needs or many other eligibility categories. We'll see accommodations for students. But modifications would be that change in the content itself. What is the student expected to know and do? So these would be with the alternate standards, and we've looked at those earlier in this course. This is also a time to consider the idea of alternate assessments, which will be covered in this module content. There's another PowerPoint here for you covering the topic of accommodation versus modification, which we discussed just previously, but it's good to have several different resources because one might fit better for you than another as you're thinking about your current or future setting. Again, the modification would alter the content or level. So for instance, if a student is reading a different book in an English class that it is at a lower level so that the student can access that book, and it's not the book that others in the general education setting are reading, then that would be a modification. If the student is reading the same book as what the peers in general education are reading, but the student has more time to get that book finished, then that would be an example of an accommodation. So modifications, again, we're looking at extended evidence outcomes. So these would be those alternate standards for the state. And if we've got an example here of a 6th grade math standard, then the extended evidence outcome would look different like this one. So we can see that the focus is still on ratio, but that this is not quite as complex in language and in nature. It is the extended evidence outcome. And we can see a clear connection between this EEO and life skills, which of course is important for any student. So this presentation will give you more information regarding the differences between accommodations, modifications, what types of progress we want to look for, and again, accommodations are removing those barriers so that students can engage and participate in that general education curriculum, receiving a standard high school diploma. We want to be creative in our instruction, and that brings us to the idea of universal design for learning, multiple modes of expression, different methods of communication of content and knowledge, use of videos, visuals, art, hands-on activities, project-based learning, as well as written demonstration of knowledge. We want to involve all of that communication, that group work and group thinking. That's just best practice. It doesn't matter if a student has an IEP or not. Here's more information, another visual for you regarding accommodations and modifications. So the accommodation would level the playing field, while the modification would change the playing field. So we're working through an alternate curriculum. There are IRIS modules for you here on both modifications and accommodations. I would strongly encourage you to go through those, just set some time aside. Those IRIS modules can be very helpful, and they can provide us with some unique examples of each of those topics. And then we do have an IRIS module here about assistive technology as well. When we hear technology, we think of a communication device that might be very complex and expensive, and those are great, but it's good to know that assistive technology does not have to be something that you can plug in or charge as a device. This could be something as simple as a calculator, or even more simple, this could be something such as a graphic organizer or a particular outline that's provided. And that would also be considered assistive technology. It's just a no-tech option versus the low-tech or high-tech option. So do expand your thinking about assistive technology, and the IRIS module will help with that too. It's not just a device that is something that has to be worked on with a specialist. You know, assistive technology, low-tech or no-tech options can be things that you implement in your classroom every day for students with or without IEPs to support learning. There's a document here for you regarding the Functional Behavior Assessment, FBA, and the BIP, Behavior Intervention Plan process. This is a Colorado Department of Education technical assistance document. There are some resource links here as well so that you can browse them further. It's just a little blurb on the FBA concept. The Functional Behavioral Assessment is not the main focus of this course, but it's good to go over it here in brief. So the FBA is a process where we're taking an enormous amount of data and information down on a behavior of concern, which we might call the target behavior, to try to identify the function of that behavior. Function oftentimes may be identified as avoidance or escape, or it could be identified as attention seeking, and that could be peer attention or adult attention. So then once we identify that clear function, the primary function of the behavior, we'll want to develop a targeted intervention that is teaching students the replacement behavior that can still be functionally equivalent for them, so they're still meeting the need. For instance, appropriately asking for a timed break using a break card could be an escape function-based behavior. We've got that functionally equivalent replacement behavior that is much more adaptive and socially acceptable than running out of the classroom, for instance. So that could be something that we're teaching, and then we can reward the appropriate use of that card with the escape that the student is looking for with a timed break that has been accompanied by adult permission or supervision. And the behavior intervention plan is all about analyzing that functional behavior assessment result and then developing a plan, as just mentioned in that example, a plan to target the need. It's a needs-based plan, looking at the function. How can we teach the student to meet this need in an appropriate pro-social manner? Here is a PDF for you regarding alternate standards and the alternate testing or assessment that would come with that. So as we're talking about the modification component, this is a lengthy document that you can review regarding the alternate testing that could occur for students. That is that standardized testing. Several other links are here for you. They'll give you examples and more information regarding assessment, modifications, and accommodations. And those could be related to assessment as well as instruction and the expression regarding instruction and learning. So we've talked about some of those examples previously in this video. This is also information regarding developing the IEP. So we'll talk about a couple sections of the IEP document. The critique document does hit on this as well. So the first thing we're doing here is the service delivery statement, and you'll see the example in blue, but this is a written narrative. This is where we're talking about what service will be provided to the child, whether it will be direct or indirect, and where it will occur. So that's inside or outside of the general education classroom, how many minutes or hours per day, week, or month, and who will be providing that service. So that could be the special education teacher, the mental health provider, the speech language pathologist, the occupational therapist, any other related service provider. But we do need that great deal of detail along with direct connections to the goals that that provider will be working on. That's always a best practice to include. So to support access to general education curriculum by working on X, Y, and Z goals related to this or that skill or content area. That could be a really nice way to beef up this service delivery statement and keep that golden thread running through the IEP, because as we know, needs drive goals, drive services. This is the grid for least restrictive environment. We did take a look at this in the critique video, but basically this is a visual representation of the narrative content that was included in that service delivery statement. So you're going to be talking about the service area, who's providing the service, how many minutes or hours per day, per week, or per month that service will be occurring, and it could be direct or indirect. So indirect, that would be more on the consultation side, and the direct service is working with that student, providing that service to that student. So you want to make sure that all of this is filled in, and these boxes below give you some more information. The blue is an example. And then down below, obviously, we have the total amount of time, which will help us to calculate that least restrictive environment when we're looking at percentage of time in the general education classroom setting, which is the next area that is addressed here in the module. So obviously, we're looking at 80% or more time in general education. That would be a student who has so few services or classes outside of the general education classroom that student is spending the majority, more than 80% of the day in general education classroom setting. We might see 40 to 79% of the time, and as mentioned in the critique video, this oftentimes might be a placement. It all depends, obviously, on the child. It really does. But just as a general rule, you might see this for students in center-based programming who go out to as many electives as possible in general education, but maybe receive strategies level programming, resource classes, special education teacher taught academic core classes to address those needs, or even students in significant support needs programming working on those alternate standards and those extended evidence outcomes. So you've got examples here. You'll need to say why that placement was selected, whichever one is selected, and which one was not. So you'll need to click those boxes in your document. And then you'll provide information regarding advantages and disadvantages for the selections. So the purpose of this is not just to be wordy and type a lot of information, but rather to ensure that we're really capturing the conversation and the consideration of options here, because parents or guardians are going to have opinions on this. The student, depending on the child's developmental stage and age, may have strong opinions on this also about the advantages or disadvantages of the placement. A disadvantage of a restrictive placement always would be a lack of access to general education content, peers, and teachers. So then we need to suggest strategies to address these disadvantages and how the advantages of the placement will outweigh those disadvantages. We really need to show that we've thought through this critically as an IEP team. And then finally, we're clicking, obviously, the educational environment. So we may see students in a separate school. We may see students in any of these other settings. Obviously, we're clicking these 80, 40 to 79%, 40 or below. So you'll just be selecting whatever is relevant for the student with whom you're working. And as another note, we'll hop back to that one. That top box is for ages 3 through 5. I just want to clarify that. So that would be on the early childhood side. And then down below, 6 to 21, that would be the majority of roles if we're working with students in elementary, middle, or high school. The prior written notice. It is very important to address other options that were considered by the team and the reason that those were rejected. So we might consider reduced time but rejected due to students' continued demonstrated need for that service. Other factors, you want to put something in here. It's important to address what might be going on with a student that could contribute. And this is an example here in green. And then finally, we're looking at transition services. This is another important part of the IEP. We do have information here regarding transition services for students who are 15 plus, and so we've got content on setting those goals as well as supplemental forms.